African Ascent during this particular sunny day would be more precise to characterize the day as in Melrose, Massachusetts, in our fabulous studio, is interested to bring in for the first time a very well-known scholar, a librarian, writer. The features of what she does are quite long. I had the opportunity of being interviewed with her at Berklee College of Music when she did a series of interviews with authors and scholars at the college, and I believe beyond, a few months ago. It is my honor to bring Judy Pinoise, and I may be mispronouncing her name, just like people mispronounce mine, and will correct them accordingly. She is an associate director of instruction and engagement at Berklee College of Music, and also on the faculty of Jewish musical studies that takes place at Hebrew College. She has written, for example, a pioneering, catalyzing article that I consumed whole when she sent it to me a few days ago on a famous but not as well known as she should be. And this will be one of the motives behind inviting Judy to this particular interview with me, with a famous cantor soprano, Julie Rosewald, I think. This particular rather longish but beautifully written article appeared in the Jewish Music Archives in 2010. The exact title of that article is so beautiful. I think it's called Julie Rosewald, a new Jewish American woman, new woman, as a matter of fact. And I have asked my guests to concentrate on telling us slowly and patiently, exactly as she did in the article, everything that we need to know about this particular cantor soprano that the world should have known by now, but not as well known as she should be. But Judy herself is an expert, a pioneer in this field. She has her own website in which she discusses Jewish music. And I need not say more because the introduction will be rather long. Judy, welcome to African Ascent for the first time.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here and have the opportunity to talk about things that I love so much, and I hope your audience will enjoy hearing about.
I'm sure. So what I thought,
I know my name.
right. Say your last name for us.
Pinolis.
Okay. All right. And so what I thought I would do with your cooperation is, as a philosopher, I like clarity of concepts. And so I think it would be appropriate to do some language discussion and introduce the concepts of soprano, soprana would have been more appropriate in the age of feminism, but in the age of patriarchy, I suppose even pioneering musicians are referred through their male descriptions. But that's another matter, and we might want to discuss that towards the end of the interview. But for now, why don't we begin with clarification of terms, I thought. So let's begin with cantor, and then soprano, soprana, what they do, what the practice entail. Just give us a crash course on these concepts first, please.
Okay. Well, this article is about, as you said, is about a woman who was a cantor, a Jewish cantor in the United States in the 19th century. It's interesting how I came across this fact because for many years I had believed that the earliest that women were participating as musical leaders in the synagogue, which is what a cantor is, a person who leads the service by singing songs and leading the worship, choosing music, leading a choir. These are different roles of a cantor in a Jewish worship service. The role goes back many, many years, back to the Middle Ages at least, and maybe earlier, where services were led by an individual who knew the liturgy well and could recite it aloud so that all could hear. And this role developed because it was believed that music could carry prayer upward to God, and that the voice of the cantor became a messenger of the people. And that is what the term originally was, Shaliach Tzibur, messenger of the people, and to bring the prayers upward to heaven through music. So the liturgy was never recited in terms of spoken word. It was always chanted. And these chants developed over centuries. They became more elaborate as time went on, and these leaders were always men. At some point, we believe, possibly around the 12th century, women and men in the synagogue sat separately, physically separately in synagogues. I'm not sure why this custom evolved, but the idea was that to be fully engaged in prayer, one didn't want distractions, and it was thought that women would distract men from being focused on their prayer. So they sat separately in the synagogue. And this custom carries over today into many traditional worship congregations, that women and men sit in separate sections of the synagogue. And you will see, if you've ever looked at any architecture of many older synagogues, that many times there's a gallery, and women would sit in the gallery and men would sit below. This carried over into many different traditions into Europe, and then came to the United States. Subsequent to this article, I discovered that some women did in fact lead prayer during the Middle Ages, but only for the women's section. So that there were some women who were educated enough, they knew the liturgy, they could lead and sing the services. They were called a Zagran, which means in Yiddish to sing, a woman singer. And these people, of course, in those days, there weren't books to read and refer to. Not everybody had a book. Books were quite expensive. This was before printing. So any book had to be handwritten and were usually very large and weighty. So these were people who knew things by heart, and they could recite the entire liturgy of a worship service by heart, and lead others who were not as knowledgeable in that worship. And that's how the role evolved. During the 19th century and earlier, the entire system of learning how to be a leader, or shaliach tzibur, or came to be called chazan, or later in the 19th century, cantor. It was adopted when there were many reforms in the worship of synagogue. There was what we call today Orthodox or traditional Judaism, and then there was a reform movement that made it more modernized version of Judaism. And the cantors there adopted the term from the German culture. And these cantors led large choirs. They had very formalized music. They had musical training, and they were well integrated with Western classical music and knew that very well. But the original cantors were all learning as apprentices. You studied with a cantor, you became an apprentice to that cantor, and then you became a cantor. Just as many other jobs and things, crafts that people did for a very long time. That's how you learned, was studying with a master. When Jews began to come to the United States, originally there were no cantors at all for a very long time in the United States. And congregations didn't have that kind of leadership of a professionally trained cantor. So many local people would do that role or have the role of leading the worship. A congregant who might have had more education would take over that role. And that's where we come in the 19th century, that I discovered that there was a woman who had done this, who had a great voice. She was an opera singer. She was well trained in the cantorial arts by her father, her uncles, her grandfather. They were all, her family were a family of, she came from a family of cantors. And so she knew the music. She knew how to do it. She was very well versed in Hebrew and the liturgy. And she also was trained in classical music.
Okay. Now, I want us to do this in slices, because the article that I read is quite substantial. And I really want to travel through it with you. So why don't we begin to talk about one of your expertise, which is Jewish music in its totality from the 19th century to the present, during which time you uncovered and you discussed what you called in the article, the new woman. Let's de-Jewishize that for a moment, yes. And then we will Jewishize it again at the appropriate time.
Well, this was clearly an American phenomenon. It's not really particularly a Jewish phenomenon at all. The new woman is a phrase that was assigned to women who adopted roles outside of the domestic sphere in the home, caretakers, mothers, homemakers, in 19th century America. And what happened were that women began to see themselves in different roles. They outside the home, starting in charitable organizations, helping with social work, helping with teaching, helping with different kinds of labor issues, different kinds of things that were happening, and the mass changes that were happening in the American culture with the vast numbers of immigrants who came to the United States from many, many different cultures and lands. The local women would help out and help to adopt and adapt people to America. And there were many, many different ladies' organizations and societies formed for a variety of causes. And as they began to do more outside the home, women began to see themselves in a different light. And so historians have kind of called this the new woman. This was a woman who became educated or who was working outside the home, who did activities that were not in the domestic sphere. Now, women in the arts had been a big part of education, playing the piano or singing or having some kind of accomplishment was always considered something that women had done for a very long time. This was something, especially in the middle classes and in the upper classes, women were educated in the arts. So that was not unusual. What was unusual was if a woman was quite good at it and could work professionally in the arts, once she became married, it was the custom that women would stop performing publicly and would not continue to tour or to perform publicly in music outside of their homes. In Europe, many people developed a salon where women could have these entertainments in the home, and that was considered private and not a public concert if it was in someone's home. If it was in a concert hall or a theater or a large venue, that was different. That was just how people saw it at that time. And so it was quite unusual for a woman once married to continue being a professional musician.
Okay. Now, Judy, let me take you to an area that you may not want to go to, but if you do, then it will be an area that you can explore carefully. If what you describe about the concept of the new woman is true, I have no inclination to think that it isn't. I think it is true. In what way is it different from feminism? Let's say the Me Too movement. Then it appears as if the concept of the emancipated woman was already raging in the 19th century, as I learned from that article. What is it exactly that feminism did to the concept and the practice of the new woman?
I think that a lot of people see the new woman movement of the late 19th century as kind of a proto-feminism. And they see it in retrospect, a connection between the changes, the social changes that came about and cultural institutions that were formed in the 19th century in America with feminism of the 20th century and the feminist movement. Now, of course, there were an interim where people didn't really assign this kind of thing, but women continued to work. Of course, there were many, many immigrant women who had to work. They were not working for a career or to fulfill themselves. They were working because of grinding poverty of coming into the United States, and there were sweatshops and things like that people were working hard labor, and long hours and had to do that to feed their families. So that was a different kind of thing than women who were sort of society women who were trying to meet a social need or help others through social work. And I do think that there are a lot of people who see with a feminist lens, see that these kinds of activities starting in the 19th century really did help shape American culture to the point where the women's movement came to be very active in this country in the 20th century.
Amazing. It's as if I was to humbly ask you to consider writing an article on the new woman, the pioneer of feminism.
I think there are a few people who have done that, and there are some good books that I can recommend. We can attach maybe some titles to that. And there are many scholars who have written about the new woman, which is where I found out about New Woman. Mm-hmm. And so there is some good scholarship in that area. And of course, as my article pointed out, there's a lot more to be done in terms of the 19th century, because I can say that just on the research I did on this one particular artist, many people had done research and looked into these histories before, but didn't see that Julie Rosewell was there and had this role. And it was completely forgotten about for a very long time. And it made me feel that there were probably other women who had roles that were significant at the time, but have been forgotten about, or sort of glossed over because women were not written about or kept in the histories as much as men were. And there has been trying to correct the record on that. There's been work for the last 50, seems like the last 50 years of trying to correct the record and make sure that we know more about the roles of women and the kinds of things that they were doing in actual real fact, but just weren't considered important enough to be written about.
Absolutely, Judy. I think I had the audacity to share with you the last episode that I did with famous and brilliant Jewish philosopher, Louis Gordon, at the University of Connecticut. And we discussed my book, about which he interviewed me, Self-Definition, during which time we covered an area that I indeed you did not cover, because my training is so analytic that I did not go to the historical background of analysis. He did. And what he uncovered is that what we call feminism, which dignifies the place and contributions of women, had already flourished in ancient Egypt, in Kemet, about 5,000 years ago. I learned this from him with a wave of documentation. And then I was very lucky to read your article, which is essentially claiming something similar, except that we have not gone back to Egypt and we begin with the 19th century. But the point is the feminism that we think is brand new in our time is, after all, not brand new, that human beings have been thinking about the sexes as early as 5,000 years ago. So I thought that might interest you.
Well, it is recorded in the Bible that Miriam led the dancing, and she was also a prophetess. So we do have women who were leaders in musical and spiritual leadership going back a really long time.
Yes.
But these things kind of seem to go in waves or patterns or in and out through vast periods of time. And hopefully we won't see a diminution of women's place and role again. In the near future, we hope to continue to have more equality and diversity and inclusion for everybody at all levels of society as well as the arts.
And now, Judy, another controversial question that I would like to ask you before we commit the rest of the time to speak strictly about this genius, Julie Rosewall. It's this. Correct me if I'm wrong. I read your piece carefully, and what began emerging in the context of reading it is the fact that Julie had to struggle to practice the music for which she has a passion. Because she was Jewish, she first had to convert, might not be the right term, but to pass as an American Christian so that she could be taken seriously.
Well, I think that she actually, it's interesting that you say that because in the period that where she was performing as an opera singer,
yes,
it's quite amazing to me about how musicians from with European training, of course, were prominent in America in the 19th century. If you wanted to be a serious musician, you had to study in Europe. And of course, she had come from Europe and had already studied in the King's Opera Theater, and had a lot of cachet, had a lot of credibility with American audiences. And in that time when she was performing, she was primarily, I would say, majority of the time, very well accepted. And her talent was so great, and her ability to memorize new music and to go on stage and perform it brilliantly was so profound that she was widely accepted. And she toured with English speaking groups. And when I say that is that an opera was popular music. This was before opera was considered elitist or, today it kind of has this elitist aura, where in the 19th century in the United States, opera was popular music. This is what people went to. You could be a very hard scrabble pioneering family, but if the opera came to town, this is what people went to. This is before radio and TV. This is before people had any way to hear any music had to be performed live. The only way you could hear good singing was if there were people that came around to your town, or traveling groups came around to your town, and you could hear some high level performances. That was the only way it happened for a lot of people. And so when people were touring around, these companies sang in English. All these European operas were in different languages, German and French and whatnot, Italian. They translated them into English so that everybody could understand what was going on. And so they were called English touring companies, but not from England, but meaning in the English language. Mm-hmm. And so all these operas that were the famous operas of the day were sung in English in the United States. It was not until later that some people began to say, oh, well, we should try to see if we could do it in the original language and see how it goes. And that when there were more settled groups, such as when, let's say, the Metropolitan Opera was a permanent group, but they didn't travel, they weren't a touring group. So these touring companies, they would go with what they called opera houses, and the opera houses, one time you might have a pop, folk music, another time you would have an opera. It was all considered, part of the same kind of thing. It was all popular music. They didn't make those distinctions that we make today between classical, elitist, as they do now. That's what there was.
Sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Continue, Julie.
Oh, okay. And so we have Julie Rosewald and her husband also, who was a local, he was born in the United States. He was a Native American in terms of having been born in the United States. He was not an immigrant, who was from Baltimore. And so he was a locally trained, when I say locally, I mean American trained musician. And he also worked with her and traveled with her. And when they did the second company that they were with, he was also a conductor. He was a violinist. He was a composer, and became quite famous in the United States as a conductor. He helped found different symphony orchestras in different communities, and was scheduled to be a conductor in San Francisco, but unfortunately he passed away before he could really do that post. So she was from a very musical family. In Boston, I wanted to mention that one of her cousins founded the Boston Conservatory, Julius Eichberg. That was her family were the Eichbergs, that was her maiden name. And so she had family in the United States, and there's a Boston connection. And he also taught violin And the family as a whole were very significant promoters of women's education in music. Her husband had been a protagonist or promoter of women studying violin in having musical education in Baltimore. So there were a lot of, very strong, what we would call today feminist leanings in the family, in the way that they thought was very progressive. She had a book that she wrote on method for singing. And one of the things that it was interesting about that was it was so progressive in terms that she was very much against the kinds of clothing that women wore in those days, the stays that constricted the body. And she felt that women should be able to breathe freely and not have constricted clothing. And certainly singers, she thought it was very detrimental to them. And her writings about this and all the medical reasons that she gave her were quoted in medical journals at the time. And she gave a lot of very good sound advice about that, as well as singing methods. So she was well known for that technique for a very long time. She was a founder of the vocal department at the Mills College of Music in California.
Yes.
Was a professor of music. Again, at a time when women were just beginning to be more widely accepted into colleges generally. There had been some women's colleges prior to that, obviously, but it wasn't a widespread custom that women would go to college. And as more and more women began to go to college and accept it, she was there teaching music in the college. So it was quite a significant and progressive. I use that term to try to show how it was making progress towards what we would consider more normative today, that women can study equally with men in college.
It's incredible. I'm not going to let you, because you're so humble, not to want to talk more about this book on method. I think this is truly extraordinary. And the implications of this advice that she has given for what we see in contemporary musical practices, in which women in particular are quartered, divided into sections by men, in light of what she is suggesting, needs a radical revision. It's as if, since you're also a professor yourself, if you so wish, a respected one at Berkeley, it's as if you can even fashion a course on method for women. I was intrigued by this, because Descartes has written about method in thinking. And here is this thinker writing about method as it pertains to the manipulation of the dancing body, the singing body, most particularly in the case of women. I think we need to talk about this and explore this even more deeply. What do you think?
I do, and it would be great to have some people who are really skilled at vocal technique today to maybe take a look at her publication from the 19th century and see which areas seem to be still pertinent today. At the time, she was often called the Marchese of the Pacific. And Marchese had been an Italian vocal teacher, a European, who had a singing method. And what was interesting was that Julie Rosewald's singing method really paid attention to the female voice and really paid attention to what women needed to do to be able to improve their singing and their voice, especially in light of all the physical restrictions that had gone on for women in terms of how they had to stand and how they had to, act and how they had to do all these things. Up to that point, there were a lot of restrictions on it because of the costuming and because of the clothing and because of the kinds of literally being squished and squeezed into these costumes and into these types of clothing, restricted what people could do and what they could breathe. And of course, we know that many women had medical problems because of these restrictions of clothing, and it wasn't healthy. That was the custom, to in the 19th century to try to draw these strings tighter and tighter to get the waist smaller for the look and the fashion look of the day, and that was quite unhealthy. And she was saying, always wear your stays, if you have stays, always wear them as loosely as possible. So she was a great believer in taking deep breath and breathing deeply, that people should be breathing deeply. And today we know how important that is for singing, for meditation, for all kinds of things in terms of health and wellness. And so she was very much ahead of her day, it turns out, and quite remarkable. And this is from her own personal experience that she developed these ideas. And one of the other things that was so interesting, that when I found it, it was something unexpected, was that she rode a bicycle. And one of the things you were asking me earlier about the new woman, and one of the aspects of the new woman was an acceptance of what they called sweaty athleticism, where if women were sweating because they had been working out and doing a lot of physical activity, that was not considered healthy. Exercise was not considered healthy. And she believed that exercise was healthy. Imagine that. So I was thinking about riding a bicycle in San Francisco. Not that easy to do for anybody. They had this, had a building that was a bicycle, where people could go around and around in a circle riding their bicycles, and it was an indoor arena that was a place that people would go to have activity and enjoy riding a bicycle inside, much as you would have some kind of indoor sports today in a facility. And women had a special lane if they wanted to retain their modesty, because it was considered so immodest for a woman to ride a bicycle.
Amazing.
And here's this kind of, middle-aged woman who was promoting good health through vigorous activity. So,
Amazing, Judy. We're not going to leave this at that. I'm now inspired for you to consider giving us a public talk, which I host in the liberal arts department, faculty lecture series, they are called them. I host them. I'm going to invite you next semester to give a public talk. I'm really impressed by this. This is one of the most substantive new knowledges that my skull has received today. I'm so grateful. So now we have about 10, 15 minutes left, I think. And I would like you to use this time in any way you want. You may want to discuss, for example, Jewish music. Um, that I think would be an area that we can cover for the next 10, 15 minutes, because this is your expertise.
Well, I wanted to cover a little bit about how remarkable it was that Julie Rosewald was asked to be a cantor in a synagogue in the first place. And what had happened, she was an opera singer. So it would be if you took a very famous singer who concertizes widely today, and they moved to town to retire, and then you ask that person to be a cantor in your synagogue, or lead the worship in your synagogue. And it was quite remarkable because there had been a cantor there, a male cantor who had died, and she had just moved to town, to San Francisco, about a few months before that, not very, very long before that. And the congregation asked her to kind of pinch hit, if you will, and come in and do the high holiday services. Now, for your audience, they may not know that the Jewish New Year was considered an extremely solemn occasion in the Jewish calendar. It is maybe brightened up a little bit, more celebratory today. But at that time, it was considered a very serious and solemn occasion, starting the 10 days of repentance at the high holiday season. And frequently, the services for those religious events are extended, lengthy services. They are have a different nusach, or they have a different song cycle. They have their own music that is special, and usually is much more elaborate than an average Sabbath worship service. So this is a person who literally didn't need too much rehearsal, and she could just step into the spot and do it. And that in and of itself is quite remarkable. Most people, even if you do it year to year to year, they practice, and there's significant time that goes into rehearsing and getting ready for the high holidays. And this is a woman who could step into that because she has such an incredible memory, musical memory, that she remembered these things from years before, when she had learned them as a child at her father's school, and also the classical music that was used during the services, and the kinds of pieces of music that were done. She could easily do. She was such a talented musician. And the other thing that was remarkable about it was that they didn't, after this emergency, that, the cantor had died, they needed someone. They didn't go right out and get another cantor. She was their cantor for 9 years. And that meant that they were quite happy with her doing this, performing in this role, leading the services and choosing the music and rehearsing the choir and so on. And that had never been done before, that we know of. Of course, you never want to say never. You never want to say someone's absolutely the first, but the first time we know of that a woman was retained in the professional role of a cantor in the 19th century. It didn't happen again with a congregation until the 1950s. So women have only been accepted with becoming ordained as professional cantors since the 1970s. I mean, there was always there were always men who led the services and the worship for so many generations, and women did not have those roles, even though women sang in choirs since the 19th century. I've been studying Jewish music for decades, and that it's an interesting phenomena that you have an independent culture that blossomed and grew and developed alongside Western culture, alongside and inside Western culture, and yet remained a distinctive culture. Many times they touch base and they influence each other in many of the lands and places and times, and yet they each developed in their own way. And cantorial music is one of those aspects where there was, hundreds of years of development of this music, which is tremendously sophisticated, improvisatory, and beautiful and expressive, that blossomed in a way that was completely different than Western music. It is consisting of materials that are non-metrical, and that the music is intended to express the text and give the meaning of the liturgical text. And that is the role of the cantorial art, is prayer and worship. That's the entire meaning of it. And everything goes to that effort to express the meaning of the words. And those cantorial arts developed and became influenced in the late 19th century by Western art music. And there was a merging between Western art music and Western music and this cantorial music that we have today, a much more Westernized version of this art, cantorial arts. And yet there are many people who practice the traditional arts as they had developed, and they're quite unique in Western culture. There are not a lot of places to hear these, but there are many, many recordings and a few great practitioners even today. We can only imagine what it must have been like before there were recordings. There were probably tremendous artists of all sorts that we, can never capture their performance practice as it was done exactly, because the printed page is only a skeleton of what and how things were really done. You had to learn from a master and understand the nuance of the music. And it was only through that way that you could grasp how the heart is cleaving to God through this musical method. And so it's something that not many people are familiar with today.
Yes, very much so. In fact, I was going to ask you a question about that, which I saved for the last minute. I did not want to be preposterous or irrelevant. Was Julie religious at all?
Yes, I mean, she was, I would say, a person who had a very strong Jewish identity, and yet she lived, of course, as a completely as an American, and artist, kind of like today's rock stars in a way, or Hollywood celebrity. She had that kind of status in society, but she had a very strong Jewish identity, and when she went to San Francisco, was happy to participate and contribute to her synagogue. So I would say, yes, she was religious in the sense not of practicing orthodoxy, but in a reform, modern kind of way that was prevalent in the culture that she lived in San Francisco.
Incredible. Julie, what Julie reminds me of is Hannah Arendt, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, along with Heidegger. And of course, our own Judith Butler, who is alive and thriving, powerful voice of the non-binary feminist movement. And now, thanks to you, I have become introduced to another great musician. Her Jewishness, of course, is partly relevant and partly irrelevant. What I want to stress is her musical genius. And Afghan Ascent was truly honored to be schooled, really, in the music of Julie Rosewald, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, cantor soprano of our time and our time. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you for a full hour.